Tonight the music
Check. All right, I think we got it.
That we can lose this crowd.
You better stop, Megan. I'm going to recruit you to Wham.
Yeah.
You're going to be a worship leader.
Years later.
Yeah.
2 years after graduation.
Just finish your master's degree. Come on back.
You're done. Welcome to TikTok Theology, a podcast that tackles the major trending topics on social media that concern the Christian faith. I'm Megan.
And I'm Steven. We know you can't form a theology in 3 minutes or less, but those videos can identify current issues. TikTok will give us the prompt, and then we'll do a deep dive. Thanks for joining us in this exploration.
Today's topic, we're chatting about church hurt, church trauma, all of those fun little words. And so we're going to jump right into it, discussing this light little topic this afternoon. It's going to be a good time.
Just deal with a little trauma. No big deal.
No big deal. Just unpacking some hurts and some pain.
All right. So church hurt. I think we've heard that term being said a lot more in the last 5 years than any time I can remember before.
I would agree. Absolutely.
And so what I think people are talking about with church hurt is essentially religious trauma, because I think it could be also outside of the Christian church, but we see it a lot of times in the context of the Christian church.
Yes.
And it's just the emotional and psychological distress that a church can cause, or people in a church or organization, maybe the pastoral structures or whatever, can cause onto people, causing them sometimes often to leave the church. That sound right?
That sounds about right.
All right.
Hey, I mean, that's pretty much the theme that I've heard across social media as our Gen Z representative.
There you go.
That
Token Gen Z.
Token Gen Zer. That's definitely the context in which I've heard a lot of conversations, especially I've been around Bible. We've been around Bible college students for a while now. Church hurt comes up pretty often.
Yeah, some of my, I'll be teaching a class that's like a ministerial class. It'll be like Principles of Worship Ministry or something like that.
Yeah.
And students will talk about their church hurt, and even like how it was an act of God for them to even go to school to do ministry or to for ministry.
100%. I also know students who had that story where they were like, I was going to go to ministry and then church hurt. And then they were like, I didn't want to go to Bible college, like all the things. And so, yeah, I think it's a pretty common, unfortunately, pretty common occurrence.
What are some of the reasons why they ended up persevering and just like going anyways?
Man, sometimes, I mean, God is after is after you, man. Like when he gives a calling, he is after you for it. So I think that a lot of people, if their church hurt doesn't cause them to leave the faith, then they may not be in church, but they still are in a relationship with the Lord. Yeah. And he's like,
so that's important. So church hurt isn't necessarily deconstruction.
No, it is not.
All right. How would you differentiate it then?
So even as we had chatted about deconstruction a little bit before, is deconstruction is kind of the dismantling of your faith, religious beliefs, theology, all the things. And a lot of people typically will journey through deconstruction and then unfortunately will walk away from the faith because they have dismantled everything that they've come to believe, decide that they don't believe it anymore, walk away. I would say that church hurt is being in the church, the institution of a church, or in some form, a congregation, on a staff, something along those lines, and experiencing a hurt or a trauma at the hands of a pastor or a leader or the church goers in general, and then leaving that church. Yeah. And then for some people it's bigger, and then leaving the capital C church altogether and deciding that they are not going to attend church services or anything because it's been too traumatic. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're walking away from being a Christian. It just, for a lot of people, is I no longer believe in the institution of church because I've been so hurt. Yeah. I still love God, and so I'm just on me and God are homies one-on-one. Yeah. But and I do have my Devo time and I read the Word and all the things. But there are people who do not go back to churches because it has a negative connotation for them. For sure.
And it makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of whackness that can go on in the church.
In whackness, indeed.
So
the church is not immune from said whackness.
No. So what do you think are some of the main causes of church hurt?
I think hypocrisy is huge. The saying one thing from the pulpit, living something completely different. Legalism is big. Just saying that there's specific, you have to do things this way, or, your faith is either disingenuous or blah, blah, blah. And this is stuff that's outside of, obviously, the biblical mandate and commands to do things. Right. But when churches are like, you have to, I don't know.
Yeah. So but even when it is biblical, I think there's still a legalistic way of saying something, like for example, famous passage when Jesus is talking with the Pharisees are attacking Jesus because they got grain and were eating on the Sabbath.
Yes.
And then they were like, "Oh, you're breaking the law, this and that," and so taking a legalistic approach, and then literally talking to Jesus, telling him he's breaking the law.
Jesus is like, "Be for real."
Yeah. and then Jesus says profoundly, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man was made for the Sabbath."
Yeah.
And so one thing that's happening here is he's taking a thing that was a rule, given as a rule, and then showing you the principle behind it. And so like the thing about rules is they can be too rigid. Like by necessity, they can be too rigid.
Right.
So they're like, have you ever had like middle school? Have you ever like middle school logic? You know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah.
If there's a group of people on this planet that are absolutely terrible, middle schoolers.
Sorry, junior hires.
No, it's all good. But like middle school is a rough time. It definitely is.
Oh
like,
yeah, being like 11 to 13 is like the worst experience of my entire life.
Yeah, it was
like,
really rough.
Those are the worst years you can be alive.
we feel it. We feel it for you.
We're all recovering middle schoolers.
Yeah, I had to teach middle school for a year.
Wow.
And it was so bad. Oh my gosh. I was a youth pastor, and that was like being a youth pastor in middle schoolers, that was not a problem.
No.
But like being a middle school teacher?
Yeah,
oh
different
my
breed.
gosh. I had to teach I taught art, and I have like an easygoing personality, but then I can be like real strict with my rules because I want like standards to be like high and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
And they just can't handle that stuff. My friend who was just like really just like, hey, quiet, silence. And like, just like he was a Bible teacher in that same school. He had them on lock. He had them trained. And I was like, what are you doing? It's just the way his personality is just very like, he's a Calvinist. You know what I mean? Like he was just very
he's like, no.
Yeah. And so, but like the middle schoolers, they would always do this. They would always have like this kind of like, well, technically, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Whatever your rule is.
They're looking for a way.
They're looking for a way, a loophole. Well, technically I didn't. So you're like, hey, class, be quiet. And then they start whispering. You know, and then I'm like,
technically, I'm not being loud.
Yeah, I told y'all to be quiet. Well, I'm whispering. That's quiet. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't. I can't with these, right? So I feel like that is what rules lend themselves to. Like a rule is rigid, so you can be like that technical person, like, oh, well, technically, I'm not doing this.
Yeah.
And so, so what Jesus was doing was he wasn't looking at the technicality of the rule, but he was looking at the heart and the principle behind the rule.
Right. The letter of the law versus the spirit of the law kind of situation.
It's the spirit of the law. Yeah, exactly. Do not take the letter for the law. That's exactly right. And so I think a church can be legalistic even if the law is a good law.
Right.
Because they're taking the letter for the law and they're not looking at the heart behind it.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah. What do you think? Because I remember there's like ways that legalism is terrible. When I was young, when I was a wee lad.
Wee lad, yeah.
when I was about like, I think 17, 18, I started growing my hair out and my hair was like super long.
Oh.
Yeah, it was my metal
phase. Yeah, I remember. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So you've seen pictures?
I have seen photos of the metal
glorious.
phase.
It was glorious.
It was like it was good stuff.
Yeah, and so I had it long for a few years, and I remember a lady at our church, and she's awesome. I love her. She was really close, almost like a family member. She was like, "Now, Steven, you can't be having long hair like that." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" She was like, "Well, you see, a good Christian boy is going to cut their hair. They're not going to have it long like that."
Come on.
And I was like, "Okay,
come on, Christian boy."
Jesus had long hair, and then she said this is totally not true, but she was like, well, actually the type of tribe that he was from, they would have had it like not that long, blah blah blah. First of all, that's not true. But then I was just like,
first of all, no.
Yeah, but I didn't even say that. I was like, all right, okay, let's take that. Well,
smile and wave.
Samson,
power in his hair,
not allowed to cut his hair. So
God likes long hair, confirmed.
There you go. That's kind of left it there. So I had a good relationship with her. She was close to us, but like it was super judgy.
Yeah.
Do you have like any encounters of that?
I went to a Baptist school, like a Baptist private school for like kindergarten through junior high.
All right.
And so I'm pretty tall. I'm almost 5'10". And so like my arms are really long, my legs are really long, whatever. And they had like a rule that was like your shorts have to be at your fingertips. Right? Because it's
tough when you have long arms.
That part. And you know, because super, you know, whatever on modesty and what's appropriate to wear and all the things to be, you know, honoring God. So it's like no sweatpants and like you have to be nicely dressed at school, all the things, which is fine. But I would like be like this much off, and my arms are long. Like like they would almost go to like my knees, and I was like, at that point I'm not wearing shorts. Right. Yeah, so at that point they're just pants. Yeah. and every single time, and they weren't short, like it wasn't an issue, but it was like, no, like, and then they would bring you in and be like, is that what Jesus would want you to wear? And I'm like, I'm wearing pants. I'm wearing capris. Like, what do you want me to do? So yeah, it just depends.
One of those issues then is like legalism that is based on cultural taboos and stuff, like cultural things that shift and change from culture to culture.
Yes.
And so that's a big part of church hurt, because you have all these rules that are added onto. And then the question is that like a colonial impulse? You know what I mean? So like, okay, no, I'm not making you a disciple. I'm making you an American disciple, a disciple in this way.
Yeah. Making you a Western disciple and making you a...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, so if you think about like, cause I'm half Puerto Rican. So like in Puerto Rico is like stinking hot. And I grew up in Florida. Like, it's really, really hot.
Right.
And like on the beach and stuff, people wouldn't be like totally covered up all the time.
Right.
But it wasn't seen as immodest.
Right.
It was because it was just like a really, really hot environment. And just like everybody kind of saw that. And so like the question is, if modesty is what's biblical, which it is, and we understand how this shifts and changes throughout culture, a lot of church hurt can happen then.
Yes.
Because of, this is my definition of modesty. This is my definition of whatever it is. Yep. But that's a culturally bound definition.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
So what do you think are some examples of like hypocrisy that can lead towards church hurt?
You know, this do as I say, not as I do from the pulpit can be really difficult. I mean, we've seen even recently the like documentaries of Hillsong and the like addressing of these kind of like
that
quote unquote,
tough, right?
Quote unquote mega churches or whatever that are like out one side of their mouth that are like tithe, give your first fruits to God, like clothe the naked, feed the poor, all that kind of stuff, and then they're like embezzling money.
Yeah.
Or they're like stealing money. Or it's like respect the institution of marriage, like treat your wife with respect your husband, like love your spouse, and then you have like 3 separate affairs that get found out.
Yeah.
And so it's like
it happens way too often.
It happens so often. Yeah. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of very public reveals of said issues, which is like the really like a hard part of the megachurch pastor and megachurch movement is like when they make mistakes, everyone sees. And then it really does color a lot of people against the church because they're like, oh, well, look at this another pastor that, does this. Or even we saw it a lot with like the Catholic Church abusing boys and young people and all that kind of stuff. And so it was like, well, how can you be, preaching from the pulpit about, the love and respect that, you claim that, the Bible teaches, and then you're going to go abuse people in your congregation? Like, what is that supposed to lead people to believe?
Yeah. So I wonder so part of this could be also how we honestly approach the things. So like, with these megachurch pastors and stuff, is a lot of it, like the fact that we make them into gods. We like kind of we idolize them. Yeah. And then when they fall, like it's really hard. It
shakes our faith. Yeah.
And then it's also it's not just on us. Like the leaders can also position themselves to be godlike.
Yeah.
And so that's a really tough one. I think that's one of the things that we saw with Hillsong, when the pastors were celebrities. Yeah. You know what I mean? When they were as popular as everybody else. You had, the pastor from the New York Hillsong hanging out with Kevin Durant and Justin Bieber and stuff like that.
All the people, right.
Yeah. And so, and just like, the way he talks, the way he preaches and stuff is all really awesome. And then, when all this stuff came out about him, and you don't want to, the problem with this is like, you don't want to be one that judges also. Yeah. Because, like, I know he's a person and he's hurt a lot of people and he needs to be held accountable for that. Yes. But he's also a person that needs, to work through this stuff himself with God. And so we don't want to just, like, completely be judgmental towards an individual, but then recognize, man, that has some really, really big consequences for the church.
Oh, huge consequence. It's like when Ravi Zacharias, that like huge theologian guy, and then he dies, and then everyone finds out that he's actually been like serially abusing women and cheating on his wife for like years. Yeah. And you're like, oh, like it makes you really like like you're reflective and you're thinking, you're like, wait a second, like, oh my gosh. And I think that that's like, I remember my mom had said this to me before, where she's like, people were not designed to be worshiped. Like people were not designed to be these mega church people. Like we weren't designed to be celebrities. And that's why so many people like completely fall apart, because we were never designed to be the object of worship. And so it's like when we idolize pastors or churches or whatever as like, this is the blueprint of what we should be doing as a church, or this is what we should be doing as pastors, then we're taking the focus, instead of being like, oh, how does God tell us? We're trying to shape it, and how, oh, well, what does Hillsong do? Or what does Mosaic do? Or what does Elevation do? And then when those people, because they are people, they fail, it feels very, very, very targeting of like, oh my gosh, like I put my faith in you, I put my trust in you to lead. And it's like, because we're supposed to be putting our faith in Jesus. Supposed to put our faith and trust in the guy who won't fail.
Right.
The guy who's never gonna have a moral failure, who's never gonna have to announce that he's stepping down, who's never gonna get burnt out, who's never going to do like, so that's the danger of like the idolization of mega churches, or trying to emulate that kind of stuff. Because then when they you know eventually fall in some way or fail, it feels like a direct hit on our faith when it should never have had that much power.
Right. All right, tell me what you think of this idea.
Okay.
So a lot of this happens because of power. And in churches, so often we have people in leadership taking this authoritarian approach to leadership.
Right.
And so I was thinking, biblically speaking, what is the leader? And we hear people talking about a servant leader, and I don't think that's wrong. I think that's actually right. We have to understand it properly, but I think that is right.
Right.
Jesus is our greatest example of it.
Right.
But like, think about how in the Bible, God identifies us. So one thing I think happens is people feel a calling towards leadership.
Yeah.
Which it could be very well the case that God is calling them towards some kind of leadership of some sort.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems is they start taking that as their identity.
Yeah.
That I was born to be this leader person.
Right.
Like leader is me. You know what I mean? And that is super problematic, because then you're thinking about like God is making one of his children to be dominant over another one for whatever reason.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I think we got to think about what is our identity? Our identity is always, I'm a child of God.
Yeah.
I'm a disciple of Christ. I'm filled with the Holy Spirit. This is the things that are actually our identity markers in this world, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes in that, God will call us to lead for particular reasons. And an example we tend to use all the time, you hear pastors use it, and rightfully so, is like the example of Nehemiah from chapters 1-7. Right. And so Nehemiah was, he was leading the Israelites back out of exile back, and then they were going to rebuild the temple walls, right?
Yep.
And so he saw this as a thing that was finite, that was not going forever. He refused to be their king afterwards. But he saw it as like a definite, like, God is calling me towards this leadership. Yeah. So I think what happens is when you make that your identity, leadership can quickly turn into lordship. You start thinking of yourself as this person who was meant to dominate. And even when we have like in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve were made and they were given dominion over all of creation. Right. It's improper to think about that as they were made to dominate all of creation. Right. What is dominion in this sense? Right. Right. So like you have this this sense of them being stewards over everything. They were caretakers. They're caretakers. Yeah. That's what it means to have dominion, is to be a steward over everything that belongs to God anyways. Yep. And but when we start thinking this dominion means domination, then like, oh, these are my things. These are my things that I can do. Right. This is my church. These are my people. Right. This is this is my situation. Exactly. And the thing is, God always intended for who to be the owner? Him. God. Yeah. Right. So like, and so think about like the Israelites when they were brought out of Egypt, when Moses brought them out of Egypt, and they created their own law. Right. They didn't have an executive branch. No. God was the executive. God is king. Yeah. And they wanted a king. They wanted a king. Like, he was like, nope. Guys. They had a judicial system, judges. Yeah. They even had a, what is that called? Like legislative system. That's right. I got you. Don't worry. The priests, right? And with the priests and stuff. Yeah. But they didn't have, the executive was God. They were supposed to be, and they had this kind of like, I will be your God, you will be my people. This is a covenant that they entered and they had. And Moses refused to be the king.
Yep.
And he is the example of how Israel was supposed to
be
led, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but then we start thinking, hey, we want a king. And just think about even what happened in 1 Samuel 8. You had Samuel warning the Israelites when they were like, oh, we want a king too. He was warning them. He's like, hey, if you get a king with just a few generations, he's going to enslave you. Yep. This is going to all happen. Everything that happened with Pharaoh and the Egyptians,
it's going to
happen to you. And by the time Solomon came, that's exactly what happened.
Yep.
That prophecy was fulfilled.
Yep.
And so if it's God's mind to be the actual leader, yet God will empower us to lead certain situations, then we should never have this idea that we're a leader as an identity marker for us. And I think a lot of church structures and pastors and stuff do. Mm-hmm. They'll see themselves as just kind of like this person who is going to lead them also in every aspect of life.
Yeah.
So like, oh, I'm your spiritual leader, but that means I'm also going to tell you how to do this and do that and dress and vote and do everything. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And they tend to overstep boundaries there because they're not looking to God. Instead, if they're shepherding, but we're all on this journey together, there is a priesthood of all believers, right? Mm-hmm. We're all in this together and we're all leading towards understanding God better and being disciples better,
right?
Then I think there's a humility that should take place.
I would agree.
And so this kind of authoritarian leadership, it can really mess a church up, right?
Yes.
So when we talk about church hurt, if a leader is dominating and seeing you that way, the worst case scenario is they can start seeing you and the flock and everybody as their property.
Right.
This is when leadership turns to lordship. Lords have, like, they took all the land. This is like they took all the land of a whole society and they said, this is now mine and you can be a tenant back into it because they dominated. They didn't steward it, they dominated. Right. They didn't serve their people, they dominated them. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's one of the biggest things of church hurt. I mean, every time I see it, I see people talking about pastoral leadership just dominating them in their lives as opposed to stewarding spiritually.
100%.
Right?
Yeah, and I think that happens even for both like a regular congregant, and then also I've heard a lot of conversations with people who've been on staff and have had a lot of pain because they are being, in a way, dominated by either the head pastor, executive pastor, whatever. Like someone high in leadership is lording over them,
right?
And being like, oh, well, you serve this church, or you serve, me or whatever. And it's like, at the end of the day, does
your mom lord over?
Although her last name is Lord.
Yeah, it's a pun.
Then she does not lord over.
Yeah, Megan is of the Lords.
Indeed, so of the Megan Lords. Of the Craig Lords, I guess.
There you go. So no lording?
No lording.
All right, good.
No.
Does anybody ever make that joke?
Yeah.
All the time?
House of the Lord is one that comes in a lot.
I like that.
Because that's a good one.
That's just good. That's
just good stuff. Yeah, that's good. The Lord's Prayer.
Did you ever do that? Like when you were growing up, if she was like being mean, you're like, you're lording over me.
I did not.
No? Oh, missed opportunity.
I know.
Man.
Bummer.
All right. So, okay. One of the ways that the leadership can be abusing is, and this is where we start talking about spiritual abuse.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Like, how have you seen in church hurt, emotional manipulating, shaming, guilt tripping? How have you seen these things kind of work out? I
feel like spiritual abuse is actually a fairly new concept that I have been familiar with as I've gotten older. Because even as a kid who was raised in church, like I didn't hear much about spiritual abuse. Like that wasn't really terminology that I was super familiar with.
Yeah, me neither.
And so I guess more recently, as I've seen, like a common one, I guess, would be like spiritual manipulation in a sense of, oh, well, if you really loved God, you would do this. Or it feels something along those lines. Like I know a lot, like I've known people who have like volunteered for churches and have been like over asked for like volunteers. And then when they want to push back on their leadership and be like, this is like, I can't be committed to like all of this, all of these hours or whatever. And then they're hit with like a response along the lines of like, oh, well, if you really loved the Lord, then you would want to serve his people.
Yeah.
Or, oh, if you really cared about the church and you really wanted to serve God, then you would do this. And so I've heard terminology like that, where it's like when you start to say things where it's like, oh, well, if you really loved God, or, oh, if you really, really wanted to serve the Lord, or, oh, if you really were serious about your calling, then you would want to do this. Or saying like, oh, God would be so disappointed in you.
So they're defining for the people what loyalty and fidelity to God is. So like, okay, God has called you. That's something. But like, if God has called you, you'll do what I'm asking you to do right here.
Yeah. The if then statements of like, if God called you to something, then you have to do this thing for me.
Right.
Or for the church.
But they're inserting themselves as a mediator between God and you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or adding cute little salvation pieces where they're like, oh, well, if you really were saved, if you really were interested in expanding the kingdom, then you would do these things.
Yeah.
And it's like, interesting.
So how could you say something like that where there is just a good pastoral insight that's not manipulative? How can you say, like, for example, you're seeing a kid or somebody that just recently got saved and then they're sinning and stuff.
Yeah.
And how do you say this is not discipleship, is not the walk?
Yeah, like this is not how we live or something like that. I'm someone who has encountered people in various stages of either, of their walk with the Lord, where they're either like mid sinning or they're trying to walk out of stuff or whatever. And I feel like what even I have learned personally is like obedience to God is out of relationship and love for him. Like, if you love me, you will obey my commandments. Yeah. Not if you're forced into it, you will obey my commandments. Like, I feel like there's something so important about facilitating someone's relationship with the Lord more than the acts of obedience, because it's like, if you're so interested in changing people, it's behavioral modification at that point. Like, oh, well, if you just do these things, then blah, 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 blah. And it's like, well, okay, like there is a way absolutely that Christians should be living and conducting themselves and all of that kind of stuff. And just because a church asks you to live that way does not mean that they are abusing you. Right. Like if you're in leadership and you're acting the fool on Saturday and your pastor says you can't lead, that's not spiritual abuse. Let me tell you that right now. But if you are someone who is learning and to live the life of a believer or something along those lines, then to be in conversation and say, hey, like, why are we doing these things? Like, let's find out the heart of like why people are either sinning or what's going on in their lives. Because even I had a friend who struggled with different sins and stuff. And he was like, the Lord didn't want to necessarily deal. He wanted to deal with sins in order. Like, you want to deal with the thing that looks bad. Like, oh, well, I steal or whatever. So it's like, oh, we got to stop him from doing that. It's like, facilitate someone's relationship with the Lord and the Lord will call it out. Like, if you push someone, you're like, okay, like, let's talk about why you're doing this. Let's partner in discipleship. Let's push you closer to the Lord. Yeah. And then the Lord, let's trust God to convict. Let's trust God to be like, that's not cool, dog. Like, because it's just behavioral modification. If you tell people like, oh, you just need to stop doing this, then they're not doing that out of a desire to obey God. They're doing it out of a desire to appease you. Right. And I feel like that's the wrong intent. Yeah, like it's towards legalism again. Yeah, where it's like just because you have a bunch of people in your church that look like they're doing the right thing, but that's why the concept of like secret sin is really like someone looks like they're doing the right thing a lot, and then all of a sudden, oh my gosh, they've been doing this thing behind the scenes for a really long time. Yeah. And it's like because it was behavior modification. It wasn't I love God so much that I want to give up all of my worldly desires. I'm dying to myself. I am putting my sins up on this cross. I am picking up my cross and I'm following God. Like, it's not out of a desire to do that. It's out of a desire to look the part. Yeah. Dallas Willard has a good way of saying it. He calls it like your sin management. Where like every day of life is just like you managing your sin so that way you're not sinning that much or anything like that. Yeah. But that's a fundamentally wrong way to live. Yeah. So you're living in the negation. You're living in the things that you're not supposed to do. Yeah. As opposed to being lived by an overflow of the Spirit in your life. Right. So there's an old sermon example that you probably have heard that I've even published about. It's just I've heard it's just good stuff. I've heard it a million times, but it's a good example. So like if you have like a cup and you want to get all the air out of the cup, what do? Do
put it in a vacuum, suck all the air out. You know what I'm saying? But like really shortly after, in any given situation, air is going to go right back into it, right? Like that's just what happens.
Yep.
And so, and it's like maybe different, but it's still air. Like it's not going to come out.
Yeah.
But one surefire way to doing it is to fill the cup.
Come on.
And let it overflow.
Oh yeah. Come on.
Overflow, Holy Spirit.
Overflow, Lord.
Yeah. So this example obviously is like if you're overflowing with the Holy Spirit, the sin will leave, not because you're focusing on the sin, but because you're focusing on the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Which is a different thing. So you're focusing on the God of life, not on the life that you just left behind.
Right.
But the thing is, I think often churches, they do what you're saying is they try to modify behavior, which is leading in that way of just like, what is the life you left behind? Let's focus on that so you not do that. Yeah. As opposed to encouraging people to live fully in the life of spirit.
Yeah.
You know, and
well, because then when people either sin or trip up or whatever in their walk, there's the immediate response is shame.
Right.
Shame. Like you couldn't hold up your appearance.
Right.
Shame.
Right.
Like, guilt tripping. Like, if you really love God, then you wouldn't have sinned.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, but we're all like works in progress. Like, we're all gonna goof. Like all of us. It's gonna happen.
Here, the greatest example I think we can have is the difference between Jesus and the Pharisees.
Yeah.
So Jesus is right. He's showing us how to live, and the way he lives is a gracious, generous God who goes to the sinners, who goes to all the people and shows them love and doesn't tell them to keep in their sin. You know, says go and sin no more.
Yes.
But like approaches them with love and generosity and grace. And then the disciples afterwards are those who are talking about life in the spirit and how that opposes life in the flesh, and how life in the flesh is governed. Paul talks about this, is governed by the law, right? Yeah. But the law is rigid and strict, but being led by the Spirit, it's not rigid.
Yep.
And so, and I think that's precisely the issue. So like the Pharisees are sitting here looking at the law, keeping the letter, right? Just being real rigid. And so you have all these like technical people like, well, technically. And then you also have like people like, oh, well, this doesn't look good. This doesn't look right. Yeah. And you have that again, when really you're supposed to just walk in lockstep with the Spirit. And then you're going to be this loving presence everywhere. Nobody's going to deny your faith because you're so loving and generous towards people. Yeah. Right? So I think we can't really speak of a one-stop shop like this is the answer against church hurt. Yeah. But we can call out that there's spiritual abuse that's happening from faulty leadership, from leadership that's not being held accountable, for them thinking, an entitlement that like I have been given this opportunity to dominate. Yeah. And then the method of what they're doing is legalistic and behavior modification, and a lot of times hypocritical. Yeah. All these things together lead to like a really bad recipe of people being hurt by 100%. The church.
100%.
So what do you think are some of the things that a Christian should do if they're struggling with church hurt?
For me, I think I have experienced church hurt in different contexts before. And even as someone who like loves the Lord so much, like got a degree in ministry, getting a master's in theological studies, like loves God.
Speaking of,
this
podcast is brought to you by the College of Theology and Ministry at Life Pacific University.
Yes, it is.
Where Megan graduated from.
Yes, I did.
With her degree in ministry.
Period.
All right. Had to put that in there before we forgot.
Of course, because we do that. Oops, sorry, everyone. And even when I experienced church hurt, it was really shaking. Like I was like, like someone who loved the Lord for real. And so even like I have seen like firsthand how really hard it can be to recover from church hurt, and
me too.
Feeling really wronged in a space that you thought was safe or something along those lines. And what I had to do, and what I would encourage anybody to do, is to make sure that that you don't put the church at the same level as Jesus. Like that you are separating like the church and Christians. They represent Jesus to a degree because that's what we were called to do.
You're supposed to.
As we're supposed to be doing. Yeah. But because we are people, we will fail. And when people fail and they do cause hurt, and you are on the receiving end of that hurt, I had to learn to separate, okay, these people are not Jesus.
Right.
Like, the church is not God. God is not these things that these people are acting. And oftentimes church hurt is because people are not acting biblically.
Yeah.
And church hurt happens because Christians are not living the way that we have Christ-like manner in which we are called to live. And so I had to separate, like, okay, God is still good, and God is calling us to be better. And Jesus is not intended for us to live like this. And I really had to put my faith back in, okay, my faith is in God. My faith is in Jesus. My faith is rooted in what the Bible says. And even if people treat me poorly, that is not going to reflect on the way that I view God.
That's good.
Because those two things are entirely separate.
That's good.
And even though the church should be better, and even though Christians should be better, sometimes we're not. And sometimes we hurt each other. And that is the reality. But also, it doesn't mean you have to stay where you have been hurt. Like, you have to process it. You are responsible for processing your church hurt. Just because you have been hurt does not mean that you now get to walk around with a chip on your shoulder for the rest of your life.
Right.
Like, God calls us to forgiveness. Even if that doesn't mean that you go back to that church.
Right.
Even if it doesn't mean you go back to where you were hurt. Because I don't necessarily believe that God calls us all to go back to where we were wounded. Like, maybe he is, but our call is to forgiveness. So if we've been hurt, we are allowed to process that, and we are allowed to have feelings about that, and we are allowed to take that to the Lord. But bring your pain and anger to the Lord, because he will help you forgive.
Right.
Forgiveness is not a solo sport. Like, we are not in it and we have to will and muster up the strength to forgive people who wrong us. But we bring that to the Lord, and the Lord helps us forgive, and then we are able to move forward.
That's
but
good.
I don't think God intended for us to, if we have church hurt, to then just turn our back on the church as a whole. I think that there's a restoration process that the Lord wants to take people who have been hurt by the church through, and eventually get back to a church, because we've been called to live in community with other believers, like all of that kind of stuff. But church hurt is real, but we are also responsible for dealing with it.
Yeah. And I think, so I've experienced it too. And I would say that, like, probably the majority of Christians have experienced church hurt to some degree.
Yes.
And so for me, and I think this is definitely part of the way God has made me. And I think people are different, and we're all, different, and importantly different.
Yes.
Purposefully different and beautifully different. But one of the things that what God made me is, like, when something didn't make sense, like, I just got, like, real fired up about it.
Yeah.
And so, but there is something about, if you experience church hurt, you are also part of the church.
Yeah.
So God could very well be calling you to be a change agent. Maybe in that church, or maybe when you lead something else, a ministry in the future, you'll know what not to do.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a professor now. I get to teach about all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
It's one of the privileges that I have. And part of it is how to, like, make a healthy dynamics in leadership, like how to healthily, lead people through problems and theological issues and traumas in a way that doesn't traumatize them further, or anything like that, right? And so, being a change agent is recognizing that there is a reality of church hurt, and that will continue to happen because people are people.
Yeah.
But then realizing that when you're in a situation like that, God might be calling you to the very difficult task of confronting it.
Yeah.
Or God might be calling you to the very difficult task of leaving.
Yeah.
And you should know which is which.
Which is which.
Because it's not, we don't want to condone just jumping around. And I think millennials and Gen Z, I think that's one of the issues
church
that we
hopping
have. We do a lot of church hopping.
Yeah, for sure.
And that is not good.
No. Because
sometimes, I think a big part of it is to know the heart of the pastor and the leader and stuff like that. He could have came up, or she could have came up from a mentality that was a little more of the domination thing, but then might be, like, totally gifted and called and, like, really, really good, just, like, needs to hear from you, like, literally needs to hear from you how something that they're doing is affecting them, coming in love.
Give
and stuff like that.
Give people a chance to change.
Give people a chance
to be better.
And that's a huge,
like, what if we don't just drop everybody who ever does one thing wrong to us, or we would all be alone. Like,
and that's a great way of saying it. Give them a chance to change. And then if it doesn't happen, and the abuse keeps happening, then see where God is leading you, because he might be leading you somewhere else, because you don't want that abuse to happen to your family. You know what I mean? And so, but it's not cancel culture. We're not going to cancel somebody, but we're going to give them an opportunity for repentance, for reconciliation, for change. Yeah. But it's also not like blindly following and not holding things accountable.
For sure.
You know what
Absolutely.
I
mean? I remember my mom would tell me a story. My mom told me a story when she was really young. She was like, I was having disputes with people, and she's like, and the Lord just called me to pray. And so I, from the time I was kind of small, was like, had this mindset of like, okay, pray for the people that have harmed me.
Yeah.
Pray for the places that have hurt me, because it's really hard to be angry and bitter towards somebody that you're praying about.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, it's really hard because the Lord's changing your heart. Like, prayer changes your heart. So if you've been in a place where church has really, really harmed you, I would challenge you to pray over them and pray about, like, my prayers to God, sometimes I just be yelling. I just be yelling. I go sit in my car, it parked somewhere, and I just be yelling. And I'm like, Lord,
so you're telling me that I need to be praying for middle schoolers.
Yes, that's the challenge of this. But I will go and I literally, like, I tell the Lord how it is. Like, I am an angry prayer. Like, sometimes, like, I am somebody who,
David,
like,
at times we got his Psalms.
Yeah, I feel like we have to be more transparent with our anger with the Lord. Like, the Lord doesn't want to just hear like when things are going really well and when you're thanking him, because like, do those things, absolutely, but not just when you're like asking for stuff.
He wants to feel the full range of who you are.
Feel the things, like, God can shoulder your anger. So literally, I will go and I will scream and I will yell and I will do all the things, and I'm like, Lord, that place hurt me, or that person hurt me, and I, like David, like, I want to see my enemies obliterated from this earth, like, and I get real existential and dramatic, and then by the end of it, I'm like, okay,
you just needed to vent
Lord,
to God.
I needed that. And then my mind, I literally can feel my, like, heart changing and being like, okay, but Lord, that place is still anointed, and you have still put a call on that pastor's life and those people there.
I don't even know how many times that realization has come to me through prayer.
Yeah.
Where God's just telling me, this is my child too.
Yeah. Because if it were up to me, I'd be like, burn.
Smite him.
Get smote. Like, smitted. Like,
smitten is not right.
Like, take the whole thing. Take the whole thing away. Like, but the Lord will bring me to a place of like, I'm angry praying. And then he's like, okay, like, now that I've gotten that out, because anger will make you bitter. Like, anger will fester. So if you get that out, and then you're like, okay.
What's important is to pray angrily to God, not to stay angry.
Not to stay angry. Yeah, pray angry. Don't stay. Come on.
Yay, that's a nice.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Write that down,
pray
everybody.
Angry, don't stay angry.
Don't stay angry. And then you're like, okay. And then the Lord will help, minister your heart and change it and soften it. And because I'm telling you, it's so hard to stay mad and stay bitter at somebody that you're praying about.
Yep.
Let me tell you something. Like,
that's good. Yeah, I think we don't have perfect answers for church hurt.
No.
And because we are also hurt, and part of what we're doing with TikTok Theology is not to just give a bunch of answers, but to kind of explore these issues a little bit.
Yeah, bring in new thoughts.
Bring in some thoughts, and just and hopefully it can be helpful to somebody who's experiencing church hurt, because it certainly is the case. It is the case. We're going to put in the show notes a book by Natalie Runyon, and it's called Raised to Stay. And she essentially writes a whole book about how to stay in church and how to stay committed to the faith and how to stay in places that you've been hurt. And so it was super powerful. She's got an incredible ministry, and she's actually spoken at LPU, absolutely brought the house down. And I would challenge you that if you're in a space where you've been hurt by the church, or hurt by Christians, that's an incredible book to really dig into, cry over. There's always resources. We'll put some other stuff in there too to help you out. And just know this is a dialogue. So just like Megan was saying during the deconstruction episode, don't deconstruct alone. Yeah. Don't go through church hurt alone. You know, there's so many people are going to empathize and feel exactly what you're feeling. Yeah. Because it's unfortunately too ever present. Yeah. And so, but just know that Jesus is there, and it's the difficult realization that Jesus both loves you and the person who's hurting you. Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, that's good. So, anyways, I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you guys for listening. We'll see you in the next one.